Imagine a map of the Atlantic Ocean, not a modern satellite image, a real map, ink on vellum, the kind drawn by hand in the 17th century when cartographers still left blank spaces at the edges because nobody had sailed far enough to fill them in. Now trace a line from the northern coast of South America, up through the Caribbean, across the open Atlantic, past the Azores, and into the English Channel. That route, give or take a few hundred miles of drift, is the path the Merchant Royal was sailing when she went down on the 23rd of September, 1641. She was roughly 9 miles off the southwestern tip of England, near a stretch of water called the Manacles, just past Land's End, heading for the Thames. She never made it. And what she was carrying when the ocean swallowed her is the reason people have been looking for her wreck for nearly 400 years. Because by the best estimates available, the Merchant Royal went to the bottom with somewhere between 100,000 pounds of gold bullion, 400 bars of Mexican silver, and close to 500,000 pieces of 8. In today's currency, the total value of her cargo has been estimated at more than $1 billion. Some calculations push it closer to $1.5 billion. That would make her, by a wide margin, the richest shipwreck in recorded history that has never been found. Not the richest shipwreck ever discovered, not the most valuable cargo ever recovered. The richest one that is still out there, somewhere beneath the seabed off the coast of Cornwall, in a stretch of ocean that has swallowed ships for centuries and given almost nothing back. To understand why the Merchant Royal was carrying that much wealth in the first place, and why nobody has found her despite the technology that can now map the ocean floor down to the centimeter, you need to understand what was happening in the world in 1641. Because the treasure aboard the Merchant Royal was not random. It was not pirate loot stashed in a hold. It was the machinery of an empire trying to keep itself alive. And the story of how it ended up at the bottom of the Atlantic is the story of the Spanish Empire at the exact moment it began to fall apart. By the early 17th century, Spain controlled more of the world's surface than any empire before it. The crown held territories stretching from the Philippines to Peru, from Mexico to the Netherlands, from Naples to the Canary Islands. And all of it, every soldier, every garrison, every colonial administrator, every fortress wall ran on one thing: silver. Specifically, the silver being pulled out of the ground in the Americas. Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, was the mother lode. The Cerro Rico mountain had been producing silver since the 1540s, and by the early 1600s, Potosi was one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere. Larger than London, larger than Paris, built entirely around a single mountain that was being hollowed out by indigenous forced labor under the Maita system, a Spanish adaptation of an Inca conscription practice that had been turned into something far more brutal. The silver came out of the mountain, was refined using mercury amalgamation, stamped into coins or cast into bars, loaded onto mule trains, and carried overland to the coast. The overland journey alone could take weeks. Mule trains wound through mountain passes at altitudes that killed pack animals by the dozens. Armed escorts guarded every step of the route because bandits, deserters, and rival colonial factions all understood that a single mule train could carry more wealth than most European towns would see in a decade. Once the silver reached the coast, it was loaded onto ships and funneled into the Spanish treasure fleet system, the flota. This was the most heavily organized and heavily guarded commercial shipping operation in the world at that time. Twice a year, convoys of galleons would cross the Atlantic, carrying the wealth of the Americas back to Seville. The fleets sailed on a fixed schedule, gathering at Havana before making the transatlantic crossing together for mutual protection. Armed warships escorted the merchant vessels. Captains received sealed orders. Departure dates were state secrets. The entire operation was managed by the Casa de Contratación in Seville, the House of Trade, which tracked every bar of silver and every chest of coins from the moment it left the mine to the moment it arrived at the royal treasury. The treasure funded everything. It paid the soldiers fighting the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands. It paid the garrisons holding Italy. It paid for the ships that patrolled the Caribbean against English and Dutch privateers. Without the silver, the empire stopped. And by 1641, The empire was stopping. Spain had been at war almost continuously for more than a century. The revolt in the Netherlands, which had begun in the 1560s, was still grinding on. Portugal had just broken away in 1640, declaring its own king after 60 years under the Spanish crown. Catalonia was in open rebellion. France, under Richelieu and then Mazarin, was pressing on every front. The military budget was astronomical, and the silver shipments, while still enormous, were no longer enough. Spain was borrowing against future treasure fleets. It was defaulting on loans. The Genoese bankers who had financed the empire for decades were pulling back. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. The entire financial system was held together by the next shipment, and the next, and the next. This is where the Merchant Royal enters the story. The Merchant Royal was not a Spanish ship. She was English. A London-registered merchant vessel, around 300 tons, owned by a syndicate of English merchants. Her captain was a man named John Limbry, and she had been chartered, which is the key detail, by the Spanish crown. This was not unusual. By the 1630s and 1640s, Spain's own merchant fleet was in decline. The empire had been losing ships faster than it could build them, to storms, to war, to the sheer grinding attrition of maintaining a global maritime network with an economy that was slowly collapsing. So the crown turned to foreign vessels. English ships, Dutch ships, even ships from nations Spain was technically at conflict with in other theaters. The commercial logic overrode the political logic. Spain needed hulls. English merchants had hulls, and the English merchants wanted Spanish gold. It was a straightforward transaction dressed up in diplomatic language. The Merchant Royal had been operating in the Caribbean and along the coast of South America for some time before her final voyage. She had been carrying cargo between Spanish colonial ports, running supplies, transporting goods, and then, in the summer of 1641, she was loaded with what would become the most valuable cargo ever lost at sea. The loading took place at Havana, the central clearinghouse for the Spanish treasure fleet system. Havana was where the separate fleets from New Spain and Tierra Firme converged before making the transatlantic crossing together. The gold and silver that had been mined, refined, taxed, loaded, unloaded, reloaded, and carried across thousands of miles of jungle, mountain, and open water, all of it came through Havana. And in the summer of 1641, a significant portion of it was put aboard the Merchant Royal. The cargo manifest, reconstructed from surviving records, is staggering. 100,000 pounds of gold. That is not a misprint. 100,000 pounds. 400 bars of silver, described as Mexican silver, meaning refined bars from the mines of New Spain, and somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 pieces of 8, the standard Spanish silver coin that functioned as the de facto international currency of the 17th century. Pieces of 8 were the dollar bills of the Age of Sail. They circulated from Manila to Amsterdam, from the slave markets of West Africa to the counting houses of London, and the Merchant Royal was carrying enough of them to fill a small warehouse. Why was so much treasure on a single ship? Because Spain was desperate. The Army of Flanders, the Spanish military force fighting the Dutch revolt in the Low Countries, had not been paid in months. Soldiers who do not get paid do not fight. Worse, they mutiny. And mutinies in the Army of Flanders were not abstract threats. They had happened before, repeatedly. Unpaid Spanish soldiers had sacked Antwerp in 1576, an event so destructive it became known as the Spanish Fury. The Crown could not afford another one. The treasure aboard the Merchant Royal was, in large part, military payroll. It was the money that was supposed to keep an army in the field thousands of miles from home, in a war that had already lasted longer than most of the soldiers fighting it had been alive. The Merchant Royal left Havana as part of a convoy and began the long Atlantic crossing. The voyage was uneventful for most of its duration, but the ship was old. She had been working hard in tropical waters, and tropical waters are brutal on wooden hulls. Marine worms, the Teredo navalis, bored into the planking. Salt and heat weakened the timber. The constant flexing of the hull and ocean swells opened seams. And the pumps, which on a 17th century vessel were hand-operated wooden devices that required constant labor, were already struggling. As the Merchant Royal approached the English Channel, the leaking got worse. The crew was pumping continuously, working in shifts around the clock, and they were losing the battle. Water was coming in faster than they could push it out. Captain Limbry signaled distress to the other vessels in the convoy. The ship that came to their aid was the Dover Merchant, another English vessel sailing in company. The Dover Merchant pulled alongside the struggling Merchant Royal, and the crew began transferring what they could. But here is the critical fact: they could not transfer the treasure. Gold is heavy. Silver is heavy. Hundreds of thousands of coins are heavy. Moving that kind of weight from one ship to another, at sea, in the open Atlantic, with one vessel actively sinking, was not possible with 17th century technology. There were no cranes, there were no containers. There were men, and ropes, and small boats, and a ship that was going down. The crew got off. Every man aboard the Merchant Royal made it to the Dover Merchant alive. That part of the story, at least, ended well. Sailors pulled sailors over the gunwales, and the last men off the Merchant Royal watched from the deck of their rescue ship as the vessel that had carried them across the Atlantic settled lower in the water, her deck awash, her masts tilting, and then went under. The treasure did not make it. On the 23rd of September 1641, the Merchant Royal sank. The exact location was recorded only in the vaguest terms, as was common for the era. She went down somewhere off Land's End in the approaches to the English Channel in waters that could be anywhere from 30 to 100 meters deep, depending on which reconstruction of the sinking you trust. The crew survived, pulled aboard the Dover Merchant. The gold, the silver, and the pieces of 8 went to the bottom. And that is where they have stayed for 385 years. The immediate aftermath of the sinking was, predictably, a scramble. The owners of the Merchant Royal wanted compensation. The Spanish crown wanted its treasure. The English crown, under Charles I, who was about to have much larger problems of his own in the form of a civil war, took an interest because customs duties on treasure passing through English waters were a significant source of royal revenue. There were legal proceedings, accusations, and counter-accusations. The Spanish blamed the English for providing an unseaworthy vessel. The English blamed the Spanish for overloading it. Captain Limbry was questioned, defended himself, and eventually faded from the historical record. But nobody went down to get the treasure, because in 1641, nobody could. Salvage diving in the 17th century was primitive beyond description. The technology consisted of holding your breath and going under, or using a diving bell, which was essentially an overturned barrel or wooden chamber lowered into the water with a pocket of trapped air inside. A diver could sit inside the bell, breathe the air for a few minutes, duck out to grab whatever was within arm's reach on the seabed, and duck back in before his lungs gave out. Edmund Halley, the astronomer who gave his name to the comet, would later improve the diving bell design in the 1690s, adding weighted barrels of fresh air that could be lowered from the surface. But even Halley's improved bell could only operate in relatively shallow, calm water. It was useless in the deep, current-torn waters off Land's End. Other salvage techniques of the period were equally inadequate. Grappling hooks dragged along the bottom, nets lowered on ropes. Occasionally, in very shallow wrecks, divers with no equipment at all would simply swim down, grab a single object, and return to the surface gasping. William Phipps, an American colonial adventurer, managed to recover a fortune from the wreck of the Nuestra Señora de la Concepción off Hispaniola in 1687 using these methods, but that wreck was in warm, clear, shallow Caribbean water. The Merchant Royal was in cold, dark, deep Atlantic water with currents that could drag a swimmer half a mile before he broke the surface. It was simply beyond reach. The wreck entered legend. Over the following centuries, the Merchant Royal became one of those stories that circulated in the ports of Cornwall and Devon, told by fishermen and passed down through generations. Everyone knew there was a fortune on the seabed somewhere off Land's End. Nobody knew exactly where, and nobody had the means to go find it. The first serious modern interest in the Merchant Royal came in the 20th century, when advances in diving technology made deep water salvage theoretically possible. But theoretically possible and actually achievable are very different things, especially in the waters off Cornwall. The problem is the ocean floor itself. The seabed off Land's End and the Lizard Peninsula is one of the most treacherous stretches of water in the world. The currents are ferocious. The tidal range is enormous. Visibility is often measured in inches rather than feet, and the bottom is a chaos of rock, sand, and sediment that has been reworked by storms, tides, and currents for millennia. A ship that sank in 1641 is not sitting neatly on the seabed like a museum display. She has been broken apart, scattered, buried, uncovered, reburied, and scattered again by nearly 4 centuries of ocean dynamics. The wooden hull is long gone, consumed by the same marine organisms that helped sink her. What remains, if anything is still recoverable, is the heavy cargo. Gold does not corrode, silver does not dissolve. Coins, buried under meters of sand and sediment, could theoretically survive intact for thousands of years. But finding them is another matter entirely. The geography compounds the difficulty. The phrase, "off Land's End," covers an enormous area. Even a relatively precise position fix from the 17th century, which is what we do not have, would translate to a search zone of many square miles. A vague report from a surviving crew member, filtered through legal depositions and second-hand accounts, could put the wreck anywhere in a zone the size of a small county. Several expeditions have attempted to find the Merchant Royal over the past few decades. The details of most are proprietary, closely guarded by the salvage companies involved, because in the world of maritime treasure hunting, information is money. If you know where a billion-dollar wreck is, you do not announce it to the world. You file for salvage rights, you raise capital, and you go get it. Quietly. What is publicly known is that no one has succeeded. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. The most notable modern search was conducted by Odyssey Marine Exploration, an American deep-sea salvage company based in Tampa, Florida, that made its name recovering treasure from other famous wrecks. Odyssey had the technology. They operated remotely, operated vehicles, ROVs, capable of working at depths far beyond what human divers could reach. They had side-scan sonar, magnetometers, sub-bottom profilers, the full suite of tools that modern marine archaeology uses to locate and identify wrecks on the ocean floor. And they spent years searching the waters off Cornwall. They found wrecks. The seabed off southwestern England is littered with them. Hundreds of ships have gone down in those waters over the centuries, from Roman trading vessels to medieval cogs to Spanish Armada stragglers to World War II submarines. The western approaches, the stretch of ocean between Ireland, Cornwall, and the Bay of Biscay, is one of the most heavily trafficked and most heavily wrecked sea lanes on Earth. Every century has contributed its share of lost ships to the seabed, and the result is a confusion of debris fields, scattered artifacts, and false targets that can make searching for a specific wreck like trying to find one particular grain of sand on a beach. Odyssey reportedly identified multiple wreck sites in the area, examined debris fields, brought up artifacts for analysis. They had the financial resources, the technical capability, and the experience. But they did not find the Merchant Royal, or if they did not announce it. which in the secretive world of commercial salvage is always a possibility, though an unlikely one given the legal and financial pressures that would push toward a public claim. Investors want returns. Shareholders want announcements. A billion-dollar discovery is not something you sit on quietly forever. The challenge is not just technical, it is also legal. Maritime salvage law is extraordinarily complex, and the Merchant Royal sits at the intersection of multiple competing jurisdictions. The wreck, if found, would likely be in British territorial waters, making it subject to the Merchant Shipping Act and the Protection of Wrecks Act. The British government could designate the site as a protected wreck, restricting access. The Spanish government could claim ownership of the cargo, arguing that it was Spanish Crown property that was never legally transferred. The descendants of the original English owners, if any could be identified, might have a claim. The salvage company that found it would have its own legal position, and the government of Cornwall, the local fishing industry, and various heritage organizations would all have opinions. The legal battle over the treasure of the Merchant Royal could, and almost certainly would, last longer than the search for the wreck itself. There is also the question of whether the treasure is still there to be found. 400 years is a long time, even for gold. While the metal itself is indestructible under normal ocean conditions, the containers it was stored in are not. Wooden chests rot. Iron-bound boxes corrode and break apart. Coins packed in barrels scatter when the barrel disintegrates. The gold and silver from the Merchant Royal, assuming it has not been found and quietly removed by someone who never reported it, is almost certainly no longer concentrated in a single location. It has been dispersed by the same forces that broke up the ship. Individual coins and bars could be spread across a debris field hundreds of meters long, buried under varying depths of sediment, mixed in with the remains of the ship's structure and the detritus of other wrecks nearby. Finding the Merchant Royal is not like finding a treasure chest on a beach. It is like finding a handful of needles scattered across a haystack the size of a football field, buried under 3 feet of mud in the dark, in a current that is trying to push you sideways at 4 knots. And yet people keep looking, because the math is irresistible. $1 billion. Sitting on the seabed, in waters that are accessible, technically reachable, within range of ports and equipment and expertise. The Merchant Royal is not at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. She is not under polar ice. She is 9 miles off the coast of England, in water that fishing boats cross every day. The treasure is right there. It has been right there since 1641. And the person or company that finds it will make one of the largest single recoveries in the history of maritime salvage. The story of the Merchant Royal is also, in a strange way, the story of how empires die, not with a single dramatic collapse, but with a series of failures, each one small enough to seem manageable, that compound until the whole structure gives way. Spain did not fall because one ship sank. Spain fell because it had built a global empire on a single commodity, silver, extracted by forced labor from a mountain on the other side of the world, shipped across an ocean in wooden boats, and used to pay for wars it could not win. The Merchant Royal was a symptom, not a cause. But she was a symptom that crystallized the problem perfectly. A country that cannot get its own money from one place to another. A military that cannot pay its own soldiers. A treasury that borrows against shipments that have not arrived yet, and then watches those shipments sink. The loss of the Merchant Royal was not just a maritime disaster. It was a line item in the accounting of Imperial decline. The Army of Flanders did eventually get paid through other shipments, other routes, other desperate measures. But the war in the Netherlands was lost. Spain recognized Dutch independence in 1648, 7 years after the Merchant Royal went down. The empire continued to shrink for the next 2 centuries, losing territory after territory, until by the late 19th century, Spain was a second-tier European power with a handful of Caribbean and Pacific colonies that it would lose in 1898 to the United States. The silver kept coming out of Potosi for a long time after 1641, but the mountain was being exhausted. The richest veins had been mined out. The mercury amalgamation process required more and more mercury for less and less silver. The indigenous labor force devastated by disease, overwork, and the sheer brutality of the Midas system, was declining. The great machine that had funded the Spanish Empire for a century was winding down, and no amount of administrative reform or military reorganization could change the fundamental equation. The money was running out. Meanwhile, the nations that would replace Spain were rising. England, which had provided the merchant royal in the first place, was building its own commercial empire. The Dutch, who were fighting Spain to a standstill in Flanders, were establishing a trading network that would span the globe. France was consolidating its power in continental Europe. The 17th century was the hinge point, the moment when the center of gravity in European power shifted from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, from the Iberian Peninsula to the Northwest. And the merchant royal, sitting on the bottom of the English Channel with $1 billion in Spanish treasure, is a monument to that shift. There is something poetic about the fact that the treasure has never been found. It sits there, theoretically, as a kind of permanent memorial to an empire that overreached. The gold that was supposed to pay soldiers fighting a war that could not be won. The silver that was supposed to keep a dying system alive for one more year. The coins that were supposed to circulate through the economies of Europe and keep the wheels turning. All of it on the ocean floor, doing nothing, going nowhere, serving no purpose except as a reminder that the sea does not care about your plans. Every few years, a new salvage company announces that it has identified a promising target in the waters off Cornwall. Every few years, there is a flurry of media coverage, a round of speculation, a burst of excitement in the treasure hunting community. And every few years, the announcement is followed by silence. The wreck was not the merchant royal, or it was too deeply buried, or the legal complications proved insurmountable, or the funding ran out, or the weather closed in, or the ocean simply refused to cooperate. The waters off Land's End have their own reputation. Sailors have called this stretch of coast the graveyard of ships for centuries, and the name is not metaphorical. The rocks, the currents, the fog, the sudden storms that blow in from the Atlantic with almost no warning. This is a coast that takes ships and does not give them back. The merchant royal is only the most valuable of hundreds, maybe thousands, of vessels that have gone down in these waters. She is the queen of a vast underwater cemetery that stretches from the Scilly Isles to the Lizard. And every wreck in that cemetery has its own story, its own cargo, its own crew that either made it to shore or did not. What makes the merchant royal different is the scale. Other wrecks carried valuable cargo. Other wrecks have been found and their treasures recovered. The Nuestra Señora de Atocha, which sank off the Florida Keys in 1622, was found by Mel Fisher in 1985 after a 16-year search and yielded roughly $450 million in gold, silver, and emeralds. The San Jose, a Spanish galleon that went down off Cartagena, Colombia in 1708, was located in 2015, and its cargo has been estimated at anywhere from $4 to $17 billion, though recovery and legal disputes continue. The merchant royal falls between these two in estimated value, but unlike the Atocha, she has never been found, and unlike the San Jose, she lies in waters that are accessible but have so far proven impenetrable. The technology continues to improve. Autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, can now survey vast areas of seabed with a precision that would have been unimaginable even 20 years ago. Machine learning algorithms can process sonar data and identify anomalies that human analysts might miss. Sub-bottom profilers can image objects buried meters below the sediment surface. Magnetometers can detect ferrous metals from a distance. Each generation of technology brings the possibility of finding the merchant royal incrementally closer. But the ocean has 400 years of head start. 400 years of burying, scattering, concealing. 400 years of storms rearranging the seabed. 400 years of sediment accumulation and erosion, of tidal cycles and current shifts, of biological processes that break down everything except the most durable materials. The gold is there. The silver is there. The coins are there, somewhere, scattered across an unknown area of unknown seabed, at an unknown depth below the sediment, in a location that was only approximately known in 1641 and has become less certain with every passing century. The Merchant Royal is, in the end, a test. A test of whether human ingenuity and technological capability can overcome the patient, indifferent, grinding power of the ocean to hide what it has taken. Every generation since 1641 has believed that it had, or was about to have, the tools to find her. Every generation has been wrong, but the treasure remains, the math remains, and somewhere off the coast of Cornwall, in cold, dark water that has not seen sunlight since the reign of Charles I, a fortune is waiting. It has been waiting for 385 years, through revolutions and world wars, through the invention of the submarine and the satellite and the computer, through every advance in human capability that should, by all logic, have been enough to bring it back to the surface. It can wait a little longer.